Hello, football fans, and welcome as we fastly approach the big game, the Super Bowl, in a new edition of Road to the Big Game. I will now be splitting this series in three parts, covering one of the teams in part one, the other in part two, and of course both teams in the season itself, and the game, of course, in part three. But the game that is, Super Bowl IX. The date, January 12th, 1975. The location, New Orleans, Louisiana, at Tulane Stadium in front of nearly 81,000 fans. The teams, one with the most dangerous passing game in the league and a rushing defense that would make even the best running backs fear for their safety and even give a couple safeties up. And a team that many thought would already be champions at this point, the Minnesota Vikings. Their opposition, one of the few defensive cores that rivals theirs and may have started to exceed them. On offense that has a gritty and aggressive running game, but a passing attack that still leaves a bit to be desired. The Pittsburgh Steelers. Neither team in the short history of the Super Bowl at this point has won one. The Steelers, in their 40-plus year history, were actually a laughingstock for many years until the early 70s. The Vikings, in their short history, since 1961, can at least say they have an NFL championship to their credit, just before the AFL-NFL merger. And they're no strangers to the Super Bowl. The Steelers are slight favorites just by 3 points to win this one. It's the Purple People Eaters versus the Steel Curtain. An all-time great quarterback versus an all-time great fullback. And here in part one, we look at the Vikings. And now it's time for our backstory. Pro football in Minnesota does have a history dating back to the 1920s, but saw very little to no success. The teams folded as the market of the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul region wasn't strong for football, or for that matter, any other sport it seemed. So much so, it wasn't until 1959 in the summer, when three Minnesota businessmen came together, that pro football was a possibility again in the Twin City region. Those men were as follows: Bill Boyer, an automobile dealership mogul for over 30 years. H.P. Skoglund, an insurance mogul and president of the American Life and Casualty Company. And Max Winter, who actually had pro sports experience as part owner of the Minneapolis Lakers NBA team. But they were on the verge of collapse at this point and about ready to move to LA for good. And the three men with the proposal were said to be awarded an AFL franchise. But now for the name. Winter was part of an ownership group for a National Bowling League team, along with a fellow by the name of Harry Gustafson. And along with Winter, the two of them were trying to think of a name for their bowling team. And Gustafson, with his attorneys, copyrighted two names. The first was the Twin City Skippers. And the Minnesota Vikings. Well, the bowling team became the Skippers, but Gustafson retained the Vikings name legally and actually gave it to Winter for the name of the new football team. In a stunning turn of events, however, NFL actually showed keen interest in bringing in a team to the Twin Cities. And with that, the ownership group forfeited their AFL membership, which was actually still beneficial because it was eventually given to the city of Oakland and the future Raiders. And in turn, joining the group will be Ole Hogsrud, who owned the Duluth Eskimos in the NFL back in the late 1920s. And part of the deal he made when he sold the team back to the league was that he'd actually have a guaranteed 10% ownership stake if any NFL team came to Minnesota, and he was on board. Also joining them was be 77-year-old Bernard H. Ritter, a newspaper mogul since 1915. And with that, the Minnesota Vikings are set to make their NFL debut in the 1961 season. But the question remains, how will their first draft go? Well, I mean, they had the first overall pick of the 1961 draft, and they took halfback Tommy Mason as their first ever draft pick. Actually, it was a pretty damn good pick. They did, however, pass up on some future Hall of Famers, but be that as it may, the interesting pick really came in the third round. At 29th overall, the Minnesota Vikings chose Georgia superstar quarterback Fran Tarkenton, someone who was passed up on by several teams feeling that he didn't have a strong enough arm for the professional game, but his expertise and his shorter pass patterns, along with speedy receivers and a tremendous scrambling ability, able to bail himself out of any jam, was key. In 3 seasons for the Bulldogs, he threw for 2,100 yards, 18 touchdowns, and 20 picks, and he had a really good 58.7 completion percentage. He led Georgia to an Orange Bowl victory in 1960, and he was first-team All-Southeastern Conference All-Star both 1959 and 1960. In his final season, he threw for 1,189 yards and 7 touchdowns and 12 interceptions and a 58.4 completion percentage, and led the conference in most categories and was second in TD passes. Also, the Vikings made a steal of a deal in terms of acquiring a solid defensive end. And that was defensive end Big Jim Marshall, who so far spent 1 year of his pro career in the CFL with the Saskatchewan Roughriders in 1959 and spent the second in the NFL with the Cleveland Browns in 1960. A tough pass rusher with agility and a lot of heart. He had a lot of fight in him, but he also had the fight of his life when he suffered inflammation of the brain during military training and had to be placed in a medically induced coma. He survived and was eager to get back to the game he loved. His one season with the Browns, he recorded an unofficial 2.5 sacks. In the Vikings' inaugural season, they were coached by the legendary Norm Van Brocklin, who was a great quarterback. He actually had just retired after a Hall of Fame career. Obviously, being an expansion team, nobody was expecting anything from the Vikings in 1961. But sports fans in the Twin Cities were over the moon to have an NFL team at last. It's also the very same year the old Washington Senators baseball team moved to the Twin Cities and became the Minnesota Twins, both teams playing at Municipal Stadium. The Vikings finished 3-11-0. It's more or less expected. Tarkenton did show some promise, however. Marshall played well, and the big positive of this expansion club was their running game with backs Hugh McElhenney, Mel Triplett, Ray Hayes, and Tommy Mason combining for 1,500 yards rushing, and Tarkenton added to that with 308. At the 1962 NFL Draft, the Vikings made a bit of a steal in taking 45th overall in the 4th round, Roy Winston, a linebacker/guard out of LSU. He played every down like his life depended on it, and that's the type of attitude that any team tries to have and seek. For the Vikings, he'll be used defensively. During his time in Louisiana, he was a unanimous All-American in his final season in 1961, as well as first-team All-SEC and second-team All-SEC the year prior in 1960. They then signed undrafted offensive lineman, center Mick Tingelhoff, out of Nebraska. He spent 4 seasons with the Cornhuskers from 1958 to 61, at 6'2" and over 230-plus pounds, but many scouts felt he didn't have the right size for the NFL. However, the Vikings felt otherwise in a decision they definitely won't regret. He was tough, strong, intelligent, and very strategic at blocking. The 1962 Vikings actually got worse, finished 2-11-1. Tarkenton still had some spark, but he wasn't exactly playing great. Their running game was still strong thanks to Tommy Mason, who had 740 yards rushing and was 10th best in the NFL, and was actually the team's leading receiver with 603 yards and was a Pro Bowl selection. Before the 1963 season, the Vikings finally found their kicker going forward. Fred Cox was a place kicker for the University of Pittsburgh from 1959 to 62. He was drafted in 1961 by the Browns, but they didn't sign him, as the legendary Lou Groza returned after it had seen that he'd retired. So the Vikings decided to give him a chance. He was also running back at Pittsburgh and actually played pretty well in the position, but he'll be used as a kicker going forward. He was a 2-time second-team All-Star selection in 60 and 61, a strong style kicker with a heavy boot velocity. He'll be a huge asset to this club going forward. The 1963 season showed slight improvement. The Vikings finished 5-8-1, and their offense improved to 8th as Tarkenton had his best year of his career so far, and their running game still stood out as Mason was again their top dog on offense. Let's get back to Tarkenton, as he made the top 10 in yards, touchdowns, passer rating, completions, and completion percentage. So he was third best in that regard, only behind Hall of Famers Johnny Unitas and Y.A. Tittle. Their defense was still trying to find their identity, but Marshall had an excellent year with an unofficial 10.5 sacks. This would be the last season for Burt Rose as GM. While Rose made a couple excellent decisions, overall, he just wasn't made for the long term. He traded away draft picks, and some of those trades were valid, and some were just outright mistakes. And he failed to sign their first round pick from this year, who ended up going to the AFL. And the Vikings would hire the visionary who would change their fortunes forever. Jim Finks, oddly enough, spent his playing career with the Pittsburgh Steelers for 7 seasons. But made his way to the CFL. He played a year with the Calgary Stampeders, and in 1957 became their general manager. And he held that title until 1964, and he took the Stamps from being a middle-of-the-road team to being competitive in the West, but a Grey Cup appearance never even materialized. And that would be because of a man we're going to bring up pretty soon. But Finks was considered a smart football mind. He knew how to discover talent and hire the right people to bring out the best in their skills. And he seemed to know how to keep players happy. The job is now his, and he is ready to take the Vikings into a better direction. Now, I should reiterate that Finks did not get the job, however, until around the start of the season. So Burt Rose did lead the Vikings a nice little parting gift. With the 6th overall pick in the first round, the Vikings select Carl Eller, defensive end out of Minnesota. A towering 6'6", nearly 250 pounds. Amazing agility and speed, a quarterback's worst nightmare. He could pressure them into making mistakes, and was just pure power when it came to just hitting and tackling, and a great skill at countering blockers. He was with the Golden Gophers from 1961 to 63, and was a two-way player, often playing on the offensive line as well. In his final season, he was a consensus All-American and a first-team All-Big Ten. And the year prior, he was a second-team All-Big Ten selection. This is a great pick, as the Vikings look to send a jolt to their defensive core that is sorely needed. And hey, look at that, the Vikings had their first winning season in 1964. 8-5-1, but of course, it's the NFL, it's the 1960s, that means no playoffs. As only the division winners would play each other for the championship game, and the runners-up, however, do play in the playoff bowl. However, the new hated rival, Green Bay Packers, won out the tiebreaker rules with the same 8-5-1 record. Though many cite this as the year the purple and gold fever was starting to hit sports fans in the Twin Cities. Fran Tarkenton was selected to play in the Pro Bowl for the very first time. It's easy to see why. Top 10 in the same 5 categories, but top 5 in 4 of them this time. Tommy Mason was 8th in rushing, but Bill Brown also became the breakout star for the Vikings that year on offense, was 4th in the NFL with 866 yards rushing and adding 703 yards receiving, leading the team, as he and Tarkenton had great communication. He was tied for seconds in yards for scrimmage with 1,569. Only the great Jim Brown had more. Jim Marshall continues to be a nightmare for quarterbacks with 11.5 sacks, while Eller had a really good rookie season with 7.5. And their defensive line was about to get stronger. And their offensive ranking improved to 4th best in the league. Wow. And their defense jumped all the way up to 6th, mainly due to their awesome pass rush and great game against the rush. But the fact of the matter is the secondary is still pretty weak. Things also proved that he could make a steal of a deal too. First off, in the 1965 draft, taken in the 13th round, 176th overall, out of North Dakota, Dave Osborne. He truly was the identity of the Fighting Sioux football team. As to date, he is the only player to have his number retired by them. A tremendous combination of power and speed. If he breaks the third tackle, chances are he'll be gone for dozens upon dozens of yards and maybe all the way to the end zone. Nice late pick here by the Vikings. But, speaking of the draft, Jack Snow, who was picked in the first round by the Vikings, cried like a little baby because he didn't want to play there. So Finks, not wanting to bother with him, just said, "Fine, piss off, we'll trade you." And he sent Snow to the warmer climate of Los Angeles to the Rams in exchange for all-pro receiver Jim Phillips and young defensive tackle Gary Larson. Larson was actually picked 10th round, 133rd overall by the Rams in 1964, and he actually spent his rookie season under the tutelage and understudy of the fearsome foursome, Roosevelt Greer, Lamar Lundy, the great Deacon Jones, and the iconic Merlin Olsen. Larson was a bulldozing-style pass rusher who could make even the most unflappable QBs or even running backs buckle under the pressure, and when he hit you, you knew it. He adds further depth to this near-complete dangerous defensive line core. He never would have gotten the role at the Rams that he's about to get in Minnesota. The 1965 season didn't really progress all that well for the Vikings as much. They finished a mediocre 7-7, and it was a huge setback for their defensive core as they tanked it dead last in the league again, despite more good play from Marshall and Eller. Tarkenton had another great year and made the Pro Bowl again. He actually had an excellent receiver in Paul Flatley. Brown and Mason were again the driving forces of the backfield. It was becoming clear that this wasn't enough to get this team moving forward. And things got worse in 1966. They slipped hard to a very bad 4-9-1 record, and Finks was getting fed up with this. Their offense slipped down to 9th. Mason, however, was injured most of the season, and he wouldn't be back in Minnesota next season as he'd leave for the Rams, where his career would actually fizzle out. Brown and Flatley were still awesome. Mick Tingelhoff was the first-team All-Pro on the offensive line, and Tarkenton stayed consistent, but Jim Finks didn't think this was enough anymore, and he wants to move and shake this team. The defense did improve back again, moving up to 8th, and that was it for the first ever coach in Vikings history, Norm Van Brocklin, who wasn't exactly Mr. Popular. He's dismissed after this season. I should note that this was also the first NFL season of the Super Bowl. Well, it wasn't called that yet. It was the NFL vs. AFL World Championship game. Finks now needs to think of who he's going to hire for the job. Well, that would be native of Superior, Wisconsin, Bud Grant, who at just the age of 40 has already had a vastly successful coaching career in the CFL, the Canadian Football League. It's one of the best sidelight sultans of all time. leading the charge of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers for 10th season, with the overall record of 102 wins, 56 losses, and 2 ties from 1957 to 66. Count it up! 4 Grey Cup rings, 1958, 59, 61, and 62, and 6 overall appearances in the big game. He was awarded the CFL Coach of the Year in 1965 after getting the Bombers back to the Grey Cup game after 2 really bad seasons. Remember how I said there was a reason Finks never got the stamps to the Grey Cup? Well, Bud Grant's Bombers was why. So he was familiar with him very much. He was familiar with his coach and his style. He was calm and somewhat stoic leader, instilling fierce discipline in his players, using a mental toughness that he wanted his players to also possess. Heavy emphasis on fundamentals, teamwork, and wanting his players to have outright grit. Plus, he was used to, well, shall we say, evolving his players in a cold climate. It worked well in Winnipeg. Can it work in Minnesota? But then in an outright stunning move on March 7, 1967, just a month after Van Brocklin was dismissed, the Vikings traded Fran Tarkenton to the New York Giants for a first and second round pick in 1967, first round pick in 68, and second round pick in 69. During his tenure with the Vikings, Tarkenton and Van Brocklin didn't get along at all. And despite the coaching change, it just seemed Tarkenton needed a fresh start and Finks was willing to give it to him. But the consensus from the media was the same, and that was, Finks better not screw this up. And well, he almost did at first by drafting Clint Jones with the first round pick from the Giants that they got, second overall. Jones would have a couple good seasons, but was out of Minnesota by 1972, and he passed up on Floyd Little, a future Hall of Famer. However, the Vikings still have 2 more picks this round. A much better choice at 8th overall with receiver Gene Washington out of Michigan State, and 15th overall, defensive tackle out of Notre Dame, Alan Page. 6'4", 245. Page probably wore the colors of the Fighting Irish from 1964 to 66 for 3 seasons. Yeah, he had the size. Well, he definitely had the quickness. But what also made him were his natural instincts, his smarts. And he could disrupt a play any which way. Oh, sure, he could record sack after sack. That would prove to be true. Or pressure QBs in a big way, but he could knock down passes, cause fumbles, recover fumbles, put extra pressures deep in the team's opposing zone. I'm telling you, this guy is the complete defensive lineman, and Finks knew that. And this is the type of guy Bud Grant can really mold into being one of the best. He led the Irish to 2 national titles in 64 and 66, was a consensus All-American in 66, and he's ready for the big time. And that year they also drafted defensive back Bobby Bryant. Bud Grant's first season in Minnesota, however, was a disaster. The team went 3-8-3 as Grant put his trust in new quarterback, former CFL All-Star and former Grey Cup winner Joe Kapp, who became an icon in Vancouver as a member of the BC Lions. Kapp's first NFL season wasn't exactly what you should call good. The Vikings offense slipped all the way to 14th, that's 3rd worst in the league. Despite this, however, the running game remained solid, and the breakout star was Super Dave Osborne with 972 yards rushing, 2nd best in the league that year, only behind Leroy Kelly of the Browns. The defense, however, was the big shock, moving up to 7th in the league, and the play of Alan Page and Jim Marshall were a major reason for that, 8.5 and 8 sacks respectively. Despite the rough year, Finks and Grant were working together and had a better relationship when it came to communication than Finks did with Van Brocklin. They had the same goals and worked hard together to try and make it happen. But remember now, they do have the first overall pick in the 1968 draft. And hell yeah, it's a dandy, as the deal with the Giants pays off. Offensive tackle out of USC, Ron Yari. 6'5", over 250 plus pounds. This is the man to complement Tingelhoff in the trenches and perhaps help Kapp's NFL game evolve a bit. But very fast and agile for his size in his position, strategic, intellectual, intelligent, and a workhorse who had no quit in him at any point in the game. He would go the extra mile if he had to get nasty with a defensive lineman if it was necessary in any given game. He wasn't just an ordinary blocker. He was Bud Grant's dream player. After all, he did lead the Trojans to the 1967 National Championship. He won the Outland Trophy that same year as the country's top collegiate lineman. He was a unanimous All-American. And a year before that, 1966, was a consensus All-American. In all 3 seasons he started for the Trojans in 65, 66, and 67, first team All-Pac-8. Also, Grant and Finks knew they needed to add further depth to their defense. And they would claim linebacker Wally Hilgenberg off waivers from the Steelers, though he never did play a single game for them. He had spent his 4 NFL seasons at this point with the Detroit Lions. He was a tough tackler, but wasn't really given much of a major chance to shine, and he did see some significant field time, however. But he was never considered a primary linebacker. Either way, this is a good grab for the Vikings. For years, however, the Vikings' weakness seemed to be their secondary. Well, they're about to get a huge shot in the arm. They made a big trade, dealing former Rams Pro Bowl linebacker Martin McKeever and a 7th-round pick in that year's draft to the Washington Redskins for safety Paul Krause. Yep, things played the Skins like complete fools in this one. Krause had the hands of a receiver. That's why in his 4th season in his NFL career, he already accumulated 28 interceptions. A true student of the game. His ability to read a play is something that the Vikings certainly needed, as his anticipation and field awareness to boot was a cut above the rest. A cagey defender who avoided unnecessary risks, had both size and speed, keeping up with the best of them on the receiving corps, and a great tackler to boot. He could take a top offense out of a game, covering the top receivers in the league. He led the NFL in interceptions in his first year in the league in 1964, was a 2-time first-team All-Pro, and Pro Bowl selection in both 64 and 65. He's now coming off a season where he had 8 picks to boot. And it led to the best season so far in team history. Bud Grant has whipped this team into shape, finishing with a record of 8-6-0, and they won the NFL Central Division title for first place. Now, as I mentioned and alluded to, the league had expanded to 16 teams at this point, 2 conferences, 4 divisions. And the Vikings would make the playoffs for the very first time. Now, the team did have a strong fan following, but this season took it to a whole new level. Fans braved the record cold temperatures to witness their boys rise out of the ashes of the basement into prominence. Their pride was colored with purple and gold. And the Vikings offense had improved greatly to 8th. Their passing game still needed some tweaks, but Cap actually did have a really good receiver in Gene Washington, who caught for 756 yards. Bill Brown had 805 yards rushing, 8th best, made it to the Pro Bowl for the 4th time. McTinglehoff was a first-team All-Pro for the 4th time in his career. The defense was 6th best, and the core that would become known as the Purple People Eaters truly came to fit as a unit this year. Alan Page had 11 sacks and made the Pro Bowl. Gary Larson had a breakout year with 10 sacks, tied for 9th best in the league. Jim Marshall obtained his first Pro Bowl selection with a banner year, 10 sacks as well. And Carl Eller not only did he have 8 sacks, but was named a first-team All-Pro. And Paul Krause was the heartbeat of the Vikings secondary that had been a flatline in their short history, with 7 picks as second-team All-Pro. And the team itself bled the purple and gold, and Grant instilled toughness in this club at long last. And, first and foremost, he instilled focus in them. They, however, would lose the conference championship to the Colts, who went on to win the NFL championship and play in Super Bowl III, which I've covered on this channel. But despite the cold and cloudy skies, it's shining bright for football in the Twin Cities. At the 1969 NFL Draft, that trade with the Giants is still paying off. In the second round of the draft, they made another steal. 39th overall, they took offensive guard Ed White out of California. A tank of a man at nearly 270 pounds and 6'1", would host to give the Vikings an even stronger offensive line. He was a tried-and-true QB protector. He was a man who could give his team time to make a play. A consensus All-American and first-team All-Pac 8 both in the 1968 season. And 1969 truly was a glorious season. The Vikings had what was an epic campaign. 12-2-0 was their record. They had the best offense in the league. Joe Kapp was a Pro Bowl quarterback for the first time. Receiver Gene Washington was a second-team All-Pro. McTinglehoff, along with popular Grady Alderman, led a great offensive line in the season. And were both Pro Bowlers. The defense, numero uno. The Purple People Eaters leading the way. Carl Eller tied the NFL league lead in unofficial sacks with 15. It was a first-team All-Pro. Jim Marshall's 14 sacks were third best. Second-team All-Pro. Alan Page, 9 sacks. Second-team All-Pro. And Gary Larson, 8 sacks and a Pro Bowl. And leading the secondary, hey, it's Paul Krause again, second-team All-Pro. In the playoffs, the Vikings won a thrilling 23-20 battle over the Rams to take the West and give the franchise their first ever playoff win. Then they went on to dominate the Cleveland Browns And the Minnesota Vikings were the 1969 NFL champions. The very last, as a matter of fact. And Joe Kapp was named game MVP in the 27-7 win. That meant a berth in the Super Bowl. Super Bowl 4 against the AFL champions, the Kansas City Chiefs. The Vikings were not just favored to win, they were favored to dominate. But in a stunning turn of events, it was the Chiefs who humiliated Minnesota. 23-7. Joe Kapp lost a fumble and threw 2 picks, ultimately sealing his fate and his future in Minnesota. It was a heartbreaking loss in every sense of the word, and the Vikings had it gift wrapped and they just couldn't open it up. And the Chiefs were not just a better team that day, we have to give them credit, they were the smartest. Despite this, the swarming of fandom got even bigger throughout the state of Minnesota and for the Vikings. Bud Grant won Coach of the Year as well. Fans were confident, and so were the media experts, that this was still the team of the future. Now, I mentioned how they were the last NFL champions, and that would be because the AFL would cease operations and merge their franchises with the NFL, making the league 26 teams strong. And the Super Bowl will indeed now be the official championship game of the National Football League. The Vikings continued to build up their team as we head into the 1970s, as at the draft that year they took Stu Voigt at tight end, 10th round, 259th overall, out of Wisconsin. He had 704 yards receiving, 63 catches, 11.2 yards a catch, and 3 touchdowns. And at 6'1" and 223 pounds, he'll be a key blocker going forward as well. He's coming off a senior season where most of those stats happened, 439 yards, 39 catches, and 11.3 yards a catch, and 2 TDs. Joe Kapp went to the Patriots in the offseason, and they were now relying on QB Gary Cuozzo. Things were looking sharp for the Vikings in this new, large version of the NFL, and once again, they finished 12-2-0. Their offense was ranked 3rd, and yet again, in the number 1 defense. Gene Washington, Pro Bowl selection. Kicker Fred Cox made it to the Pro Bowl, as their running back, Dave Osborne. On defense, strong safety Carl Cassicle made it to the Pro Bowl for the very first time. But once again, it was the Purple People Eaters who stole the show. Carl Eller, first-team All-Pro again, 13 sacks, which was tied for 6th. Alan Page, 10.5 sacks, first-team All-Pro. Gary Larson, 6 sacks and a Pro Bowl selection. And veteran Jim Marshall, 6.5 sacks. Fans are bringing signs depicting their heroes in that defensive corps, wearing the colors with pride to boot. The name Purple People Eaters was so synonymous in the state of Minnesota, not just in sports anymore, but in popular culture in the state. The Vikings looked poised to win it all. Then in a stunning turn of events, in the divisional round of the playoffs, they would lose 17-14 to the San Francisco 49ers, who are making their first playoff appearance since 1957. The Vikings were now starting to be deemed as chokers in the sports media. At the 1971 draft, one of the later picks for the Vikings, 50th round, 388th overall, was strong safety Jeff Wright, who many felt didn't have the size to make it in the NFL. But the Vikings took a chance on the Minnesota Golden Gophers star, his first-team All-Big Ten in 1970 and second-team All-Big Ten the year prior. And it adds more depth to their defensive backcourt, which was almost complete, it seems. But then they acquired Nate Wright, an undrafted corner with speed and tremendous coverage abilities and quick hands. He began his career at the Atlanta Falcons in 1969, but just after 3 games, went to the St. Louis Cardinals, where he spent the rest of that season and all of 1970. In 2 seasons, he had 3 interceptions and 2 forced fumbles. The Vikings continued to be ridiculously good in the 1971 season, finishing 11-3-0. The Vikings offense, however, plummeted to 18th in the league, as their 3 QBs had consistency and injury issues. Bob Grimm was the bright spot on the receiving corps with nearly 700 yards and a Pro Bowl selection. And Ron Urey was a first-team All-Pro on the offensive line. On the defense, Paul Krause was leading the ever-growing secondary, as the 3rd straight season the Vikings had the best defense in the league. But this may have been the best year ever, arguably, for the Purple People Eaters, who as a group held down quarterbacks to a passer rating of barely above 40.0, one of the lowest ever to this day from a defense in league history. And Alan Page had a truly spectacular and marvelous season. His sacks only tell part of the story. He was the one leading the pressure, and if he didn't get you, the other ones did, and he helped make it happen. The strategy was built around his approach. So not only was he a first-team All-Pro, he was also Defensive Player of the Year. But wait, that's not it. He was also League MVP, Most Valuable Player, the first ever defensive player in NFL history to win the award, conveying what he truly means to this club and just how great he really is. Also, Carl Eller was also a first-team All-Pro this season. Jim Marshall had 8.5 sacks. Larson had 3.5. The Vikings, however, once again just couldn't get it done in the playoffs, as their lack of offense was again exposed, losing 2012 to the eventual Super Bowl champions, the Dallas Cowboys, in the divisional round. It was clear this team needs a star QB to lead them going forward. At the 1972 NFL Draft, the Vikings, 10th overall, took Jeff Simon out of Stanford, a really good pick to strengthen that linebacking core. At 6'2" and 235 pounds, he both had size and off-the-jump quickness that Bud Grant looked for. Great instincts, versatility, pretty good at pass coverage too, and outright toughness. In 3 seasons with the Cardinals, or Cardinal, depending on the year, he was a consensus All-American in 1971 and first-team All-Pac-8 in both 1970 and 71. In the 9th round, 232nd overall, the Vikings took Charlie Goodrum, an offensive tackle out of Florida A&M, who stood at 6'3", was close to 260 pounds. He gives the team more size for sure. He will not join the roster until 1973. However, as Gene Washington deals with many issues, the Vikings do need more on the receiving core. So they obtained grossly underrated John Gilliam from the St. Louis Cardinals. Experienced wideout with 5 seasons of NFL play, he's a focused receiver determined to make any given play matter, and man, was he one of the best long ball receivers in the game. He could really fool the opposition with any given pattern that ultimately leads to big yardage. He began his 2-season stint with the Saints in 1967 as a primary kickoff returner and was a popular fan favorite, but he got more of a chance to shine with the Cardinals. In 2 of his 3 seasons there, he had more than 900 yards receiving. In total in his NFL career, he has accumulated 3,334 yards and 185 catches, averaging 18 yards a catch, and has scored 18 touchdowns. He also has 1,255 kick return yards and 2 touchdowns in that regard. The 1971 season saw him catch 837 yards on 42 catches, 19.9 yards a catch, nearly 20. Second best mark of his career, and 3 touchdowns. This is a very good grab for the Vikings. The Vikings needed a new punter, so they obtained Raiders booter Mike Eyeshade, who has spent all 6 seasons of his career with the Raiders. He has an AFL championship ring from 1967 to show for it and played in the 2nd Super Bowl. He averages a very good 42.3 yards a punt and has totaled 15,381 yards punting in his career. Injuries, however, limited him to just 2 games last season. He has, however, made the top 10 in yards per punt 4 times during his stint in the AFL, but the Vikings still need the right quarterback to lead them going forward. And they know just the guy. Well, they actually knew just the guy before the draft back in January, but I just want to build up the drama a little bit. On January 27th, 1972, the Vikings made a trade with the New York Giants, sending veteran quarterback Norm Snade, who did not pan out, Pro Bowl receiver Bob Grimm, running back Vince Clemens, who has not played a single game for Minnesota, a first-rounder in that year's draft, a second-rounder in 1973, for quarterback Fran Tarkenton. Yes, Fran is coming back to the Twin Cities. Let's see what he's been up to since the previous trade. Well, in the last 5 seasons with the New York Giants, he has actually done very well. He has thrown for 13,905 yards passing, and in the top 10 all 5 seasons for that regard, 103 touchdowns, top 10 in 4 seasons, 1,051 completions, 55.4 completion percentage, top 10 in both categories in all 5 seasons, a passer rating of 81.0, top 10 in 4 seasons. He has a Pro Bowl quarterback 4 straight times from 1967 and 1970, bringing his grand total in that regard to 6. Problem was, Giants suck. They didn't make the playoffs once, and they were only getting worse. 1971, however, he threw for 2,567 yards, 11 touchdowns, 21 interceptions. But he did have 226 completions and a very good 58.5% completion percentage, but a not so good 65.4 passer rating. Either way, the Vikings are very happy to have number 10 back wearing the purple and gold. And indeed, fans are psyched for what 1972 has to offer. And they go 7-7-0? What the f***? Well, a very puzzling year for the Vikings, who just suffered bad consistency issues. I mean, it wasn't Tarkenton. He was in the top 5 in those 5 big categories. The offense did improve to 12, as Gilliam actually proved to be a huge factor. He became the first Vikings player to reach 1,000 yards receiving in a season with 1,035, second best in the league, only behind Harold Jackson of the Eagles. And he obtained his first career Pro Bowl selection. Ranieri was a first-team All-Pro again to boot. But in the biggest puzzling aspect of the season, the defense plummeted to 11th. Despite, well, some of the Purple People Eaters still playing an elite game, I don't know, it just seemed weird. Page and Eller were second-team All-Pros. Larson still played okay, I guess, but not near as well as years past. And same with Marshall, who had a puzzlingly bad year. Either way, Paul Krause did have a great year, however, with 6 interceptions. It was a second-team All-Pro for a third time and a Pro Bowler for a fifth. But as a result of this, they missed the playoffs for the first time since 1967, which was Bud Grant's first year coaching the club. But there were some naysayers out there, but it was clear to more people than it wasn't that this wasn't a fall from grace. The Vikings, they weren't a bad team. It just wasn't a good year. And Finks and Grant weren't going to panic. They were just going to get back to the drawing board and regroup and readjust a few things. And they knew they were losing Gene Washington to the Broncos. To add more strength to the backfield as Bill Brown's play diminishes, 12th overall in the first round, the Vikings take Chuck Foreman from Miami. 6'3", 200 pounds. Wow. He could take off with that big run, but could power through the most powerful defenders. He was great on short yardage situations as well, and had insanely quick hands to make short catches. In total, in 3 seasons with the Hurricanes, he has 1,631 yards rushing, 13 touchdowns, 732 yards receiving, 3 touchdowns, 13.1 yards a catch, totaling 2,263 yards from scrimmage. He's coming off a 1972 season where he ran for 484, caught for 557, 3 touchdowns, each in catching and running, 6 on the season. That means 4.5 yards a carry, 15.1 yards a catch, and a total of 1,041 yards from scrimmage. The Vikings also took defensive back Jackie Wallace in the second round out of Arizona as second-team All-American. And in the third round overall, 65th overall I should say, they took Jim Lash, a receiver from Northwestern. First-team All-Big Ten in 1972, tremendous reach and able to make big play catches. He had more depth potentially to the Vikings receiving core. In 3 seasons with the Wildcats, he had 1,479 yards receiving, 667 coming in the final season, 86 catches, 36 in the final season, 17.2 yards a catch, 18.5 in 1972, and 6 touchdowns, 2 in each season. And the Vikings were poised for a rebound season in 1973. And rebound they did, and then some. But Grant, again, did not take his eyes off the prize, and neither did his players. Back to a great record of 12-2-0. Their offense improved to 9th best. Tarkenton was top 10 in the 5 big categories again, including second in passer rating with a 93.2, only behind Dallas Cowboys icon Roger Staubach. But Chuck Foreman became the big breakout star this season. 801 yards rushing, he added 362 yards receiving, and he won the NFL's Offensive Rookie of the Year. John Gilliam was again second in the league in receiving with his 907 behind Harold Carmichael of the Eagles, and garnered another Pro Bowl selection. Ranieri is truly the man leading the way in the trenches again with his 3rd straight first-team All-Pro selection. The Vikings defense, however, shoots all the way back up to second. Jeff Simon at linebacker had a breakout year, becoming one of the more vicious tacklers in the game, achieving his first Pro Bowl selection. Paul Krause, another banner year. But Bobby Bryant really doing it big on the secondary. 7 interceptions, 3rd best in the league. And the Purple People Eaters were back at it. Page and Eller again were the top dogs. First team All-Pros this year. 3rd time for Page, 5th time for Eller. Jim Marshall was great this year with rebound season with 7 sacks. Larson did have his struggles, but he actually picked it up really well by the end of the season. And they returned to the playoffs, of course. It was an exciting outing in the divisional round with last year's NFC champs, the Washington Redskins. The Vikings defense killed the Skins' chance of a comeback, and they won it 27-20. And now they're going to the NFC Conference Championship. And they're looking for a bit of a revenge as they took on the Dallas Cowboys. And the Purple People Eaters gobbled up Roger Staubach. But it was the Bobby Bryant show as he had 2 of the 4 interceptions the Vikings took away from Staubach that evening and won it 27-10. They are going back to the Super Bowl. And in Houston, Super Bowl 8. They take on the defending Super Bowl champion, Miami Dolphins. Oh boy. Yeah, it didn't end well. The Fish were also 12-2-0. They were favored in the game. They were also undefeated the last season. And the only defense better than the Vikings that year was Miami, led by future Hall of Famers such as Nick Buoniconti. And they had punishing a future Hall of Fame fullback, Larry Zonka. Yeah, Vikings lost 24-7. Zonka just ran all over them. Yeah, they did play bad, but this was not exactly what I call a choke job. This was simply Miami just being that damn good. But now it's 2 Super Bowl losses. The culture of pro football in Minnesota has evolved from fans simply just being happy to have a team to now having an undying passion for their Vikings. Fans and mascots dressing as Vikings, painting themselves in purple and gold in frostbite temperatures. Sports in Minnesota at this time was actually doing quite well. The Minnesota Twins, they had some success in these recent years, appearing in the 1965 World Series and won division titles in 1969 and 70. They had iconic players such as Harmon Killebrew and Rod Carew. They drew really good crowds also at Minneapolis Stadium. But it just seemed the effect the Vikings had on the Minneapolis-St. Paul region was untouched in this era. And now the fans and of course the players want to see that Lombardi trophy held high. Grant and Finks will do all they can to make it happen as we approach the 1974 season. But that does it for part 1, and we'll come back to our Heroes of the Purple and Gold in part 3, because in part 2, we go to America's Steel City and look at what leads up to the building of the 1974 Season 4, the Pittsburgh Steelers. Please like and share the video, subscribe to the channel, and until next time, I'll see ya.